Tonight on KQED Newsroom, California's public schools are inching toward reopening. What will happen in these final months of the school year? Our expert panel weighs in. And he's been both celebrated and condemned during his revolutionary first year in office. San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin joins us for tonight's deep dive interview. Plus, we visit the vivid murals of San Francisco's Mission District for this week's edition of Something Beautiful. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. Across the state, the pressure to reopen schools that have been shuttered for almost a year by the pandemic is reaching a boiling point. State lawmakers, the governor, and teachers' unions have been wrangling over how to safely get kids back in classrooms, while some school boards are facing lawsuits and even recall campaigns over not moving quickly enough. Some schools say they'll offer in-person learning only after all teachers are vaccinated, but Governor Gavin Newsom has said there isn't enough vaccine to go around. Meanwhile, many private schools have already reopened their classrooms, raising concerns about equity and who's getting left behind as the pandemic wears on. Joining me now by Skype to dive into this topic are KQED Senior Editor of Education and Equity, Julia McEvoy in Richmond. Hello, Julia.
Hello.
And Oaklandside Education Equity reporter Ashley McBride in Oakland. Hello, Ashley.
Hi, Priya.
Julia, Governor Newsom and members of the state legislature have been at odds on school reopenings. What's the latest direction at the state level?
Well, I think it's pretty exciting, actually. Just yesterday, the governor laid out a plan that he wants to put into place to vaccinate all teachers across the state who want to be vaccinated. He's talking about 75,000 vaccinations a week ongoing. This would be done through mobile units. Teachers would receive a code that they would use to make their appointments with, to make sure they're really getting what they're supposed to be getting. And he wants to do this in all 58 counties. In Oakland and LA alone, he's talking about mass vaccination sites two times a week for the next 2 weeks. And I think, Priya, you could look at this as kind of a practical move because, while the governor did side and does side with the Center for Disease Control, which says you can reopen schools without getting teachers vaccinated safely, you can do this. Teachers unions across the states have really balked, and teachers are insisting on getting vaccinations. And a lot of the public sides with them. And I think you're just going to have a hard time, forcing teachers back into classrooms if they don't feel safe to go.
Yeah. And Ashley, how will these state decisions impact local district measures, such as in Oakland, where you cover?
So there's a couple of different ways. The state's Department of Public Health has really been responsible for setting the guidelines for reopening as it relates to testing and PPE and case rates and things like that. Right now, Alameda County is still in California's purple tier, but we are within the range that the state has said elementary schools are allowed to reopen, which is fewer than 25 new cases per 100,000. And districts like Oakland Unified are also looking to the state legislature to provide funding to help support reopening. There's a bill moving through the legislature now that would provide money to districts throughout the state so they can transition back to in-person learning. Oakland would have to apply for that funding by April 1st and commit to reopening their elementary schools by April 15th. But the district still does have to come to an agreement with their labor unions, including the teachers union.
And do those dates seem realistic to you?
I think they do. Some people would probably say that's too late, and many parents and families want to see students back in the classroom earlier, as soon as next month, March.
So, Julia, in San Francisco, the school board has shifted gears, really based on community outrage. They've announced they're going to stop work on renaming schools, which was a multi-year equity project, and now they're going to focus solely on reopening. But there's still a recall effort against 3 of the school board members. So is the San Francisco School District any closer to an agreement on reopening?
Yeah, they're really on the hot seat. It's become a national story because our COVID case rates have been so low compared to other cities that have already reopened, like Chicago and New York, right? But both sides bargained hard through last weekend, and they were back at it again this week. That being said, at last check, the unions were calling for a trusted moderator to come in, so that doesn't look too good. And their proposals were pretty different. It's interesting. The teachers are looking at 4 half days a week in the morning, bringing kids in, and the kids would stay with their same teachers and then presumably go home in the PM cohort in the PM to do virtual learning. But the district is putting something forth a little bit more complicated, kind of leaving it to each school to figure it out with their parents, depending on demand for kids to come back in. And they're saying, look, if a school can bring in small cohorts 5 days a week full time because only a few parents really want to send their kids back, let's make that possible. And they're kind of just stuck right there between those at this point. And as you say, there's been a very vocal, more affluent, media-connected parents groups who are extremely angry that the district and the union haven't been able to figure things out for third through fifth graders, right? And let alone what's summer school going to look like, and what about next fall, and why haven't we been able to get this done by this time? I think it's understandable that they're frustrated, because what we're looking at right now is just negotiating over pre-K through second grade in the first wave right now. Those would be the only kids to come back right now.
The youngest
in like,
ones,
a couple of weeks if we're lucky.
Right, the ones that we've heard are at lower risk of transmitting the disease if they even get it. Ashley, Julia just mentioned summer school, and I know that they're moving forward in Oakland in terms of talking about summer school. So has the teachers union, the parents, and the school district been able to come together there more than they have in San Francisco?
Well, like Julia said, there has been a contingent of parents who have really been pressuring the school district and the union in Oakland to get to an agreement more quickly, because we are approaching, a year since students have been in the classroom. Some of the main points that the district and the union seem to disagree on are exactly when it's safest to bring students back. The district, in line with state guidance, wants to start welcoming students back as soon as they can, because we are under that threshold of 25 new cases per day. The teachers union has been pressing for schools to wait until we are in a lower tier, and they've also been pointing to rates in Oakland specifically, and not just the county, particularly in Fruitvale and East Oakland, which have been more severely impacted by COVID-19. But there are some points that the district and the union do seem to agree on. One is that vaccinated teachers would be asked to come back first, and that in-person learning would prioritize the youngest students, similarly to what Julia said, pre-K to second graders. And then there would also be opportunities for students, older students who just need more support, like unhoused students or students who have just disengaged with distance learning altogether, to come back.
So, Julia, there have been some outlier proposals for reopening that frankly seem absurd. For example, the Los Gatos-Saratoga Union School District had made a proposal for reopening for just 1 hour a day. So what models do you see proposed that may be actually workable?
Yeah, I mean, Priya, I really think that's the question of the moment, right? What does hybrid learning really look like for students, for families, for teachers? And in more suburban districts like Orinda, Piedmont, Larkspur, Corte Madera, smaller, more wealthy districts, they're all doing hybrid, because when you've got parents divided, you have to come up with a model that serves the kids who are still going to be at home, the kids who are going to come in, and then doesn't break the back of teachers trying to juggle all of that. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road right now, as these negotiations are going on right now. It's the question around how does distance learning gonna work out. So let's take a look at Orinda. They've come back for 4 days a week, 3 hours a day, nearly 3 hours a day each morning. Then they break and they release the kids to go home for lunch. They don't allow anybody to eat on site, and there's good reason for this. That's when the masks come down and things can happen. We've seen that through some recent CDC study information out of Georgia this week, actually. And so in Orinda, when the kids in the AM come in and then go back in the afternoon, then the kids in the other half of that class comes in for the afternoon of that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this sort of back and forth between the smaller cohort and isolated. And that's been a pretty common model. I will say this model can be, I think, difficult on working families, because you've got to drop your kids off in the morning and then pick them back up again, just 3 hours later. And if you're a working parent trying to do that in the middle of your workday, I think that's really tough.
Yeah. And Ashley, what are you hearing from parents in Oakland? Are they all eager to send their children back to school full time as quickly as possible?
In Oakland, parents and families' views are extremely varied. Even those who seem to be in agreement that school should open, they all have different reasons for thinking so. For a lot of parents, they're seeing the toll that the social isolation has had on their students. They're seeing that their children are losing motivation or suffering from depression or other mental health concerns. For some families, they're seeing that their kids are falling behind academically and they want to return for that reason. And then there's also parents who have to go to work and they don't like leaving their children at home all day, or they can't really monitor distance learning. There are a lot of families who are very hesitant to send their children back to school buildings. They feel like the risk is just too great, that their student could contract the virus and bring it home and maybe pass it along to their grandma or grandpa or other adults who live with them, and they just don't want to take that risk. I've heard from a lot of parents who have said distance learning isn't great, the Wi-Fi doesn't always work, our kids aren't interested in being on Zoom all day, but they still feel that that situation is better than sending their child back to school and possibly risk them coming down with coronavirus. There was a survey that the school district did last fall asking how families felt, and it was pretty split. About 41% wanted to send their students back, 27% didn't, and 31% were unsure in Oakland. But it was done in November and December when we were really hitting the peak and the surge in COVID rates. So it's possible that by now more families may be open to going back to school.
All right, Ashley McBride with the Oaklandside, Julia McEvoy with KQED. Thank you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another elected official with a recall effort building against him is San Francisco's district attorney, Chesa Boudin. Boudin was a deputy public defender before taking on this job. He's been in office now for a year, following an election day surprise in which he narrowly won. He's the son of two Weather Underground activists who were incarcerated for murder in 1981, and he campaigned on promises of progressive change and criminal justice reform. Over the past year, Boudin has made history as the first district attorney in the modern era to charge a police officer with homicide. He was also the first in the nation to eliminate cash bail in criminal cases. Mr. Boudin joins us now by Skype to discuss his first year in office and, of course, what's ahead. DA Boudin, hello and welcome back to the show.
Hello, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So the criminal justice system is under far more stress than it was a year ago because of the unexpected, the coronavirus. Tell us about your first year in office and how the pandemic has impacted your work.
Well, we faced obstacles we never could have imagined or predicted, unprecedented challenges that none of us have ever seen personally and, of course, professionally. Courtrooms shut down, virtually impossible to do jury trials, converting almost overnight from paper filing and charging processes to electronic, converting thousands of old paper case files from paper to digital. It was a huge lift for my staff and for all of us involved in the justice system. And we did it even as we had to work from home and even as we had to face staffing shortages caused by budget cuts because of the pandemic.
So I want to very briefly give you an opportunity to toot your horn a little bit. What have you accomplished this year?
We have a lot to be proud of despite these challenges. We managed as a city to see crime rates fall by over 25%, even as we decarcerated. We successfully closed County Jail 4. We avoided an outbreak of COVID in our jail, something we saw across the country. And we innovated new cutting-edge policies to support victims and uplift those most directly impacted by crime.
As you just mentioned, according to San Francisco Police Department statistics, crime is actually down in the city overall from a year ago, but in some categories it's really spiked. So yes, car break-ins are down, but commercial and residential burglaries are way up. What's your sense of how safe and secure people feel in the city right now?
There's no question that we need to do a better job making people feel safe, and of course also making people be safer. It's a constant challenge. The pandemic and other changes in the last year have dramatically impacted crime trends, and all of our criminal justice law enforcement partners are doing our best to keep up with changing crime trends. I know we can do a better job, and I know we will in the year ahead.
So you've noted that the SFPD has to clear cases, that is, make arrests before you can charge a suspect. And that's happening at quite a low level, about 8% right now. But the police department is also facing significant challenges with funding and budget cutbacks. So at this point, are you ready to chant, fund the police?
I never was an advocate for defunding the police. What I know is we need to be more efficient in how we spend our tax dollars when it comes to criminal justice. Some of the old policies we've tried for decades clearly have not worked. We need to be more creative, and we need to make sure we're using our limited police resources to focus on serious and violent crimes. In 2019, only about 5% of police responses to calls for service were for violent crimes in progress. let's focus public health experts on the overdoses, on the mental health crises, on the homelessness issues, and allow police to focus on what they are uniquely positioned to do: respond to violent crimes, investigate them, clear them, so my office can prosecute.
Some of the problems that have been highlighted recently seem to have stemmed from a lack of proper communication between departments. And to that end, this week, you and the mayor's office and the police have all put forward ideas about how you're going to change that going forward. Could you walk us through what some of those problems have been and what changes you're planning to make?
Absolutely. We deal with supervising and potentially prosecuting a wide range of people. And the majority of them that police bring to us for charging have not been arrested in San Francisco in the last several years. But a significant percentage have been and are on some kind of pretrial supervision or post-conviction supervision, like probation or parole. We need to ensure that the information our partner law enforcement agencies have about people they are supervising, probation, parole, for example, that my charging assistant district attorneys have access to that information, and vice versa. We need to ensure that when someone is arrested by police who's on probation or parole, those agencies are notified, they can share information, and that it's a reciprocal process. So we all know what each other know. That didn't happen in a couple of high-profile cases. And unfortunately, gray areas and gaps in communication resulted in very, very serious consequences. Going forward, it's my hope and my commitment that we have redundancies in communication and efforts rather than gaps.
You have some very strong ideas around drug and mental health services. You've noted that 75% of those who are booked into our county jail have some sort of drug or mental health problem or both. You're also in favor of safe consumption sites. Now, implementing some of those policy ideas is going to take not only funding, but time. So in the meantime, there's a concern, even among some of those who voted for you, that your desire to rehabilitate people rather than incarcerating them has led to more petty crime and less personal safety. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, the challenges in the criminal justice system today took decades to establish. It's going to take time to fix them and undo some of the real serious problems in the status quo, in the system I inherited. I never expected to solve all the problems in the criminal justice system in my first year, even if we hadn't been shut down by a pandemic. But petty crime is actually down. It's down by historic margins. Larceny, auto burglaries, shoplifting, down by about 40%. And some of that crime has sadly displaced into commercial and residential burglaries. We're prosecuting the vast majority of cases that police bring us. And when people have prior arrests, 2 or more in the last 3 years, we're prosecuting more than 70% of new arrests the police bring us. We will continue to use all the tools at our disposal to keep San Francisco safe.
So what's your vision of what an ideal criminal justice system would even look like in San Francisco?
Here's the critical thing. We need to prevent crime, deter crime, and detect crime more effectively. And when police make an arrest, we need to treat every single arrest as an opportunity for intervention, for transforming lives away from crime, and for breaking this cycle, this revolving door that we know is an issue from coast to coast, from north to south, everywhere in this country. The criminal justice system has been defined for decades by recidivism, by people who go into jail or prison and come out and reoffend. We need to get at the root causes of crime. We need to make sure we understand what is driving criminal behavior and that we hold people accountable in ways that changes what they do when they're released.
Unfortunately, we're facing a budget shortfall in San Francisco because of the pandemic, a very significant one. We're not in a position to implement some of these changes. Your attorneys are overloaded. The courts are moving slowly. So what does realistic change actually look like in this next year or two?
You're absolutely right. In a traditional year, my office would have completed around 300 jury trials. In 2020, we were only able to complete around 30, about 10%. And most of those trials were done in January and February before the pandemic shut us down. So we have a tremendous backlog of cases. My misdemeanor team, for example, has gone from around 100 cases per lawyer to over 250. We've got to figure out how we can move forward with all of our justice partners to find fair, just resolutions to this backlog of cases in the year ahead.
Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon, formerly in San Francisco, has struggled to implement rather aggressive reform measures there. His own deputy DAs filed a lawsuit against following his orders, and so far that lawsuit has been upheld. So would changes to the criminal justice system be more effective if they were more incremental?
You know, the reality is there are those people who are so deeply committed to the failed status quo that they will use any change, any reform, and any tragedy as an opportunity to try and roll back racial justice and data-driven reforms. It's not going to work. The reforms we are implementing here in San Francisco and across the country are widespread, they're popular, and they're supported by decades of research. This is what voters want, and voters want it because it actually makes us safer.
And the concern seems to be that it's not making us safer.
Well, it is. If you look at crime statistics, as you already said, crime is down by over 25%. Violent crime is up in some parts of the country, but by far less in San Francisco than in cities like Oakland or San Jose.
To be clear, DA Boudin, you have said that the drop in crime is not something that you claim credit for, that is, perhaps it was coming, perhaps it's the pandemic, but that we shouldn't be judging you by that drop in crime.
Well, I agree with you, but by the same token, you shouldn't be judging me then by the categories of crime that have gone up. In other words, if you want to accuse me of being responsible for everything that happens with crime rates, then give credit and responsibility. But don't pick and choose which categories to assign responsibility to me or my office. The reality is people, the fearmongers, the police unions, the folks who believe that more incarceration is the only way to build public safety, have always said if we decarcerate, crime rates will go up. And we saw exactly the opposite in San Francisco this year. We decarcerated, we reduced reliance on our jail. We had to do so because of COVID. We saw a reduction in the county jail population by about 40%, even as crime rates plummeted. So all those folks who've said to us that the only way we can build safety is to put more people of color behind bars, this year, the statistics we see around crime, around incarceration rates, around effective investment of resources in our communities showed that those fear-mongering lies are exactly that.
Is there anything you wish you'd done differently in your first year?
Absolutely. I wish we'd done lots of things differently. I wish we'd predicted the impact that COVID was going to have. I wish we'd been more aggressive in asking for the resources we needed during the COVID budget crisis. I wish we'd had far better communication with parole and probation and other agencies that we work with every single day. And I wish we'd had more staff on the front lines to be more focused on every single case that we prosecute. At the end of the day, every case involves a victim and involves someone accused. And each of those people come from families and from communities that are impacted by crime. We need to do a better job remembering the humanity, remembering the people behind the case numbers. And the more staff we have, the more victim service advocates we have, the more effective we'll be going forward.
You've said that voters should judge you in the years to come based on your record, and you've talked about the recidivism rate. So I'm curious where the recidivism rate is right now, where you would like it to be in 3 years.
Well, sadly, San Francisco's data systems are really antiquated. We're using a case management system that the court has been using for at least 4 decades. It needs to be updated so that we can have more precise and more real-time answers to questions like yours. What I can tell you is that we are filing more charges against repeat offenders in my administration than was true in the previous 2 years. What I can tell you is that we are seeing lots of individual success stories of people who have been released from custody with appropriate supervision and transitional care, who are going on to remain sober and crime-free and commit to their families and to giving back to their communities. We want to see that more often. We want to see it across the board. And it will be easier when homeless shelters and treatment facilities open up to their full capacity in a post-pandemic era.
What do you need most in order to accomplish the vision that you have?
We need buy-in from community stakeholders. We need people who can help ensure that every single time someone's arrested who suffers from drug addiction or mental illness or being unhoused, that when we release them, there are folks in the community there ready to support them in their sobriety, in their search for employment, in their search for stability, so that we can break this cycle, we can break this revolving door.
one last question for you. You come from a Jewish background, and you've spoken about how the phrase "justice, justice, you shall pursue" has been very meaningful to you. Why? What about that particular phrase has led you down this course in life?
Well, of course, it's a quote from Deuteronomy, and it's also was inscribed on the chambers of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Supreme Court chambers. It's also something that, because of my own personal experiences, growing up, visiting my own parents behind bars, celebrating Passover as a child in my mom's prison visiting room year after year, that's really profoundly inscribed in who I am as a person, thinking about justice in all of my interactions, whether it be with my wife, my nieces and nephews, or with the people whose criminal cases cross my desk as San Francisco District Attorney.
Chesa Boudin, San Francisco's District Attorney, 1 year into the job. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
This week, California said goodbye to one of its visionary leaders, a man who was known as a spiritual godfather to members of the Beat generation, the poet and publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Friends and admirers gathered outside Ferlinghetti's legendary City Lights bookstore in San Francisco for a memorial on Tuesday night. Ferlinghetti co-founded the bookstore in 1953, and it quickly became a gathering spot for countercultural poets, such as Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. Here is Lawrence Ferlinghetti reading from his own poem, "The World is a Beautiful Place."
The world is a beautiful place to be born into, if you don't mind happiness not always being so very much fun. If you don't mind a touch of hell now and then, just when everything is fine, because even in heaven, they don't sing all the time.
Lawrence Ferlinghetti was 101. Murals have become part of our urban landscape, adding culture and history to streets and sidewalks. The murals of Clarion and Balmy alleys in San Francisco are in the spotlight as tonight's look at something beautiful. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter at Priya D. Clemens. And you can find more of our news coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. From all of us here at KQED Newsroom, thank you for joining us. Good night.